Before we start today's episode, I just want to say the data packs that I've used were originally created by Mojang. All I've done is edit the noise settings within to create the effects that we're about to see. So with that said, Gloomy here, and in today's episode we are going to have some fun with floating islands. From my previous video where I showed you how to use MBT Explorer to create a floating islands, all vanilla biomes, world type, I had a couple of questions on whether this would work with 1.17, and I think this world right here demonstrates that it does. So I'll drop the link to that previous video in the description below, and you can follow that tutorial and generate a floating islands world with the new blocks in 1.17. This method, however, doesn't work if you are wanting to use the experimental features datapack provided by Mojang, and that's where really the fun begins. So let's dive in and see what we have. So my first attempt at trying to get the experimental datapack to give us some cool floating islands resulted in this, where if you look at the bottom of those, you've actually got the floating island terrain gen, with the rounded bottoms and the flat tops, but everything's floating in an ocean that pretty much empties into the void, which I think is pretty cool because we're getting these amazing cliffs pretty much everywhere where we would have had drops into the void in the previous world type, and you can kind of just see through the trick of the rendering the bottom of the islands just over there. And what else is cool, if we sink on down into the water, we can now see under the world. And now on to our next world. This iteration of the floating islands world has much deeper land masses, which looks quite spectacular, especially that waterfall over there in that big cave. It's dissimilar to the standard floating islands because the tops of the terrain aren't smoothed out, and you should get hills and mountains are appropriate. But another cool feature is you kind of get sub-levels, which is almost similar to the Nether in the way that they have vertical biomes, but sadly we can't have vertical biomes in the overworld without a lot more tinkering. And if someone figures out how to do that, let me know in the comments, because that'll be pretty cool to explore in the overworld. And with that said, if those are the less beefy computer, or would just like a standard floating islands, we can move on to the next world. Oops. So our last iteration is what you'd expect from a floating islands world type. We've got the shallower land masses, but they're less uniform on the bottom than if you use the MBT Explorer method, because we get all of the generation trying to be done through the experimental features datapack, which makes for some interesting shapes. But the tops of these chunks of terrain on the whole are flatter. You won't get hills, you won't get mountains, without actually having to have the bigger terrain generation. So for those not familiar with using data packs when creating new worlds, you hit the data pack button, you can drag and drop a data pack from your downloads folder, pop them into the selected section. If there's an error, it'll crop up there, and we can create a new world. And there you have it. That is how easy it is to get all the cool experimental features in your floating islands or biome world. Now you may be thinking, Kalumi, that thumbnail had another world that we haven't looked at yet. You'd be quite right. So for the final world, which is a bit of a bonus, and was a complete accident when messing around with the data packs, I present to you the water world. Now this world has an interesting challenge involved. There is no terrain other than what generates around the structures. So that outpost out there in the distance, spawn on this little stone stroke deep slate island. This village only has terrain where structures are generated. Not all structures generate. You do get strongholds and you do get the ruined portals. But I've not yet found many other structures, which might put some people off. But this is almost like a skyblock type world where you're extremely limited. At times I've run this, I've always spawned in a village, which is a good place to start. But you're going to have to be quite lucky if you want to actually try and get far in this world type. It's important to note with this world that once you've put in the data pack while creating the new world, you then have to go into more world options and set the world type to floating islands, otherwise it won't work. And you just get a floating islands world that floats above an endless ocean. So there you go. 5 fun new worlds to try. If you liked the video, please hit the like and subscribe button. I've been Cooley and I'll catch you next time.